This film is aimed at those of us who value individual freedom and personal property rights, for those of us who resent being taxed so heavily and bossed about so much, who fear the drift of Western society to a new kind of totalitarianism, where the state can monitor where we are and what we do, and in the name of saving the planet or public health or protecting people from being offended, can intervene in our lives in an ever more intrusive and intimate way. The signs are everywhere that this is happening, but who's behind it? What social forces are at work pushing us in this direction? I'll argue in this and the following films that there exists in America and across the Western world a secret ruling class. People sometimes refer to the deep state, but what I'm talking about here is far worse, far bigger, far more powerful. It constitutes a significant section of society, an entire social class that has steadily grown in size and power over the past century, whose very existence, whose jobs and income depend on depriving the rest of us of our money and freedom. I could have called these films The Mystery of the Invisible Class, or The Class with No Name. Strangely, an entire social class has managed to go completely unnoticed. It is not to be found in history books or in newspaper articles. It's missing from academic and public discourse. You've never heard of it. It's odder still that it should be anonymous and invisible because it is the most powerful class in society. It's the class that makes up the establishment. It's nothing less than the ruling class, and it's the most formidable, zealous enemy of free market capitalism and personal freedom. This class thrives on anonymity, so the first thing we must do is give it a name. I will call it the New Class. It's not a brilliant name, but in my defense, I didn't come up with it. In 1957, a book was published in America, The New Class, an analysis of the communist system. The manuscript for the book had been smuggled out of communist Yugoslavia and had been written by one of the most senior figures in the regime, Milan Djilas. Djilas had been born into a poor peasant family, rose through the ranks of the Communist Party and ended up vice president in Tito's communist government. But he was appalled by the socialist system he himself had helped to bring into being. It did not, he realized, represent the victory of the working class. It was the victory of a new, oppressive, parasitic, bureaucratic elite of party members, administrators, planners, regulators, and petty officials of every kind. The communist revolution had led to the complete authoritarian rule of what he called the new class. For the new class, he said, it was vital that it should deny its own existence. This, he said, was the biggest deception the class must accomplish. It cannot admit to having a set of interests other than and opposed to the rest of society. Rather, it must present itself as disinterested and neutral, working for the benefit of all. The source of power for this new class was public administration, its power to regulate and control everybody else. The new class, he said, finds itself unavoidably at war with everything which it does not administer or handle, and must deliberately aspire to destroy or conquer it. As a result, the new class opposes any type of freedom. The new class, he said, has a voracious and insatiable hunger for power. No other class in history has been so cohesive and single-minded in defending itself and controlling that which it holds. And this includes control of speech and thought. Djilas spoke of the dark, intolerant, and all-inclusive might of the new class. He clearly had a low opinion of them. He called them robot bureaucrats, willing to renounce everything decent and truthful and moral to defend their power, the power of the ruling hierarchy. For daring to publish his book, Djilas was sentenced to 15 years in prison. A year after Djilas's book came out, the left-wing economist J.K. Galbraith published his famous book, The Affluent Society, in which he observed with great satisfaction that just such a new class had emerged in the West. In America, Britain, and elsewhere, governments were assuming ever more responsibility for and control over their various economies and the lives of their citizens. It was this, said Galbraith, that was bringing into being a Western new class. It's easy to forget just how much government has expanded in the last century, and with it, the size of this new class. At the start of the 20th century, several companies in the US employed more people each than the American government. In the White House, it was said President Cleveland had to answer the telephone himself, and even open his own front door. Britain likewise. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, state spending was a few % of GDP, single figures. What changed everything was the First World War. The First and Second World Wars were total wars, in which Western governments, to varying degrees, assumed control of almost every aspect of social and economic life. Individual, privately owned companies began to be viewed collectively as industries, to be measured and regulated in the public interest. To fight the war, governments said they should be allowed to dictate production goals and quotas and pricing, to assume control of imports and exports, take charge of agriculture and transport and distribution. To deal with the social consequences of war, governments greatly expanded public welfare and public health. And to plan and administer this great endeavour, a large number of new ministries, departments, committees and organisations sprang up. In Britain, within the space of just 4 years, the government established the Ministries of Munitions and Shipping, Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Labour, Ministry of Health, of Pensions, of Reconstruction, the Joint Industrial Councils, the Department for Science and Industrial Research, the Medical Research Council. Then came the National Industrial Board, the Central Electricity Board, the Agricultural Wages Board, Coal Board, Potato Board, Milk Board, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the British Overseas Airways Corporation, and so on and on. And this was all before the Second World War, which further greatly expanded Britain's state bureaucracy. All this created vast numbers of new tax-consuming jobs. To inform this enlarged planning administration, data had to be collected and studied, reports written, strategy reviewed, performance measured, legions of statisticians and economists had to be trained, general managers, accountants, personnel officers, clerks of every kind had to be hired. When problems occurred, new committees had to be formed to make further reports and recommendations. In 1948, the political economist John Jukes observed in awe that in a short space of time the British government had hired no fewer than 2 million administrative staff. This vast planning bureaucracy, he pointed out, constituted a new self-interested social group. Each official, he said, represents a vested interest in planning. In America, likewise, the First World War saw the creation of the War Industries Board with its price-fixing committee, which determined industrial production and prices, the War Labour Board, the Shipping Board, the Railway Administration, the Food Administration, the Fuel Administration, and so on. As with the UK, the end of the war saw some retreat of government power, but not all the way, and not for long. The New Deal in the 1930s saw an explosion in the number of new government agencies. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, Farm Credit Administration, Farm Security Administration, Civil Works Administration, Federal Works Agency, Public Works Administration, Works Progress Administration, National Recovery Administration, National Relations Board, and many more. So many they became known collectively as the alphabet agencies. And with the Second World War came a further wave of government expansion. Government money began to flow not only directly into public administration, but also into funding what became known as the third sector of research institutes and universities and a range of other non-governmental organisations, to create what would soon be talked about as the publicly funded arts, science and education establishments. These various organisations all had and have their own bureaucracies. They did and do rely on public funding. They do not function as private companies operating under the discipline of the market. They owe their existence to the notion that government should oversee, guide, promote, and regulate. In America, the number of people whose jobs are paid for by government is more than twice the number of Americans working in manufacturing. By some estimates, as many as 3 times. This is the new class. Members of the new class naturally tend to look favourably on their own activities, would like to see their powers increased and their responsibilities extended. This is entirely understandable and human. They believe the jobs they do are good jobs. The functions they perform they consider necessary and beneficial. The new class maintains that society needs expert analysis, expert advice, direction, and they are the people who will do it. They demand more public spending, regulation and planning as naturally as a stream flows down a mountain, because public spending pays their wages, and they are the regulators and planners. Members of this class encounter one another in the workplace, socially, and their views become honed and hammered out. Their arguments are repeated and buttressed and refined, and over time they become a distinct, coherent, moral view of the world. Their favourite newspapers are dedicated to reflecting this worldview and are charged with interpreting the latest events accordingly. Members of this new class will always call for something to be done, to solve a perceived problem. in the form of another inquiry or review or committee or institute or ministry for some research into this or that area, for more laws and statutes and official guidance, or the funding of more support groups. If there is no problem to justify an extension of their activities, a problem or threat or risk must be found. The problem can never be big government. This would be to blame themselves. It must always stem from unregulated activity, and the solution must be more state spending and control. The idea that we should be left to our own devices is entirely antithetical to them. Freedom will be used irresponsibly and irrationally. Just as nature abhors a vacuum, every unregulated activity taunts them. A typical member of the new class might earn the same amount in money terms as, say, a car dealer or commercial realtor, but that does not give them the same class perspective. No. The commercial middle class hankers after lower taxes and lighter regulation, but this is anathema to the new class. The idea of genuine free markets, unsupervised, unconstrained, unregulated, makes the new class shudder. The new class, of course, must find a reason for confiscating our money. The current distribution of wealth must be declared unjust, to be adjusted by them. There must be essential services which the new class, rather than the market, should provide. There must be problems everywhere that the new class needs to address with our money. It needs injustice, inequality, poverty, racism. It needs obesity epidemics, offensive speech, hate crimes. It needs public health threats and climate chaos. The new class is a bureaucratic solution in search of a problem. The new class, by definition, is absolutely at war with laissez-faire free market capitalism. For the new class, lower taxes and less regulation are a direct challenge to its livelihood. The new class, though it does not say it outright, is implacably against the notion of private property. It ought to be up to the state run by them, to determine how much of our money, our earnings and savings we will be allowed to keep. And so for the new class, it's axiomatic that capitalism is cruel, oppressive, inefficient, corrupt. The new class must see market failure everywhere. Order must be imposed by them on the anarchy of the market. To this planning class, freedom itself is an affront. For the sake of the poorest, for the marginalized, whatever that means, for the sake of all of us, our lives must be defined, limited, and policed by them. The new class must disguise its hunger for power. Instead of demanding state control, which sounds sinister and objectionable, it calls for democratic control. After all, who could object to sweet-sounding democratic control? But by democratic, they do not mean control by the demos, by ordinary people. Democratic control of the economy does not mean that control of buying and selling and producing, distributing, etc. is to be left in the hands of ordinary individuals spending their own money. That is what free markets are. Democratic control means nothing other than state control by the new class. The new class is immensely powerful. It runs public administration, it runs our universities and schools, and the countless publicly funded research institutes. It runs the OECD, the WHO, the UN, the EU. The new class is the establishment. But it must deny that it exists as a separate class with its own distinct interests. It cannot admit that its members want more or better jobs, more money, more power for their own personal advantage. Our taxes, they say, do not go to support and enrich this new class, but rather they go to make the world a better place, more fair, less unequal. Taxes, they say, will be spent either in all our interests or in the interests of the poorest and most needy. It just so happens that the people who will manage this great redistributive civilizing effort is the new class. Anonymity is required in order to distract us from the parasitic nature of the new class. But how is a class so large and powerful contrived to conceal its very existence? The new class has managed to stay so well hidden because these are the very people who usually talk about class. In the ranks of the new class are the very intellectuals, sociologists and others, who take it upon themselves to analyze and understand society. Marxists in particular have defined very effectively what classes we're supposed to look at and to blame for the ills of society. But you will never hear a Marxist academic or commentator mentioning the new class. They look away and pretend that this, their own class, is not there. They've written themselves out the picture. Through constant drumbeat repetition, they depict our current society as a capitalist society, dominated by a ruling capitalist class, which stands opposed to the interests of the workers. Modern capitalistic society, they tell us, represents a great essential injustice, which can only be mitigated by us handing ever more money and power to the state. This then is my brief introduction to the new class, but I've barely scratched the surface. To understand the full reach of the new class, we must look at the relationship between the new class and what Europeans call the intelligentsia. When we do that, we see that membership of the new class is not limited to those on the public payroll, and that the power of the class extends into the higher levels of corporate capitalism and privately owned media. And that's the subject of my next film. I'm Martin Durkin, and this is Guerrilla Science.